Hello everyone, and thanks for viewing. A few weeks back I had one of my subscribers reach out to me and ask about a great resource for being able to tie schematics back into the physical location of the components on the radio chassis itself. And I referenced a few great videos out there that had been done in the past, but taking the time here to document my little Majestic International, and again, it being a TRF receiver in such a simple design, I thought I would take the opportunity itself just to show all the components here for the RF amplifier and the detector section of the radio itself on the schematic, and what that looks like and how everything ties in on the chassis itself. Again, for folks that have been in the hobby or in the engineering field for a while, this probably adds no value, but for folks just getting started in the hobby, hopefully you'll find it informative and helpful. So let's get started. So the first thing we'll look at here is the long wire antenna, and again, I really wouldn't call this a long wire antenna. It's probably about 50 to 75 feet of wire. And I'll just take this and run it outside across my roof line, or up in some trees about 30 to 40 feet up or so at times. Again, this ties into this coil, and I can't remember, I saw this schematic for this long wire antenna a while back. So you can see I've got a dowel rod there, and I think it's got about 100 or more turns of the wire. And that just connects itself here back to the antenna coil, or that first RF coil. And again, if you look inside the tube right here, let me see if I can get this notated. In that area you'll see a capacitor. So let's look at that on the schematic now. Okay, here's the long wire antenna. Again, you can see I'm just tracing this out in yellow, and it comes up here. And there's a knot there tied, and again that just loops inside the coil itself and ties right back to this capacitor inside the coil itself. And then the other side of the capacitor is just tied right back here to that connection point on top of the coil. So if you go back over to the schematic itself, and again if we look at this, we've got our long wire antenna here, and it's just represented by this symbol here. And simply, again, the long wire antenna comes down, goes through, in this case, a 0.047 microfarad capacitor. And again, you can see the connection point here that we're looking at, as I have denoted. Okay, if you go back to this area here where the capacitor itself attaches itself here to the coil right here, you'll notice there's a red lead, and if I can highlight that, it kind of goes back this way, and then you can see it here, and it runs across the top of the chassis and ties back into the volume control itself, again, which is in the RF section of the radio. And again, you can see that denoted here on the schematic here that I'm highlighting back to this connection point here. Here's the volume control itself, located on the schematic, and then you can see the physical location here on the chassis. And again, this was our lead coming over that connection point that we were looking at just a bit from that first antenna coil. Now again, if you go back and look at the volume control itself here, you'll notice that that center wiper location is tied to the chassis ground, is notated there in that center segment. Now this particular volume control, again, you can see it's inserted in the RF section of the radio, so the purpose itself is to shunt some of the signal itself from the antenna itself, because you'll see that lead coming from the antenna, and it actually controls the grid bias of the RF amplifier. So that's really the purpose itself. It's increasing or decreasing the grid bias there, and also at the same time shunting the RF level coming in from the antenna as needed. And that's how the volume itself is adjusted in this particular radio. To recap real quick, this connection point here on the antenna coil that I'm calling out is the L1 location here is noted, and again, best I can tell on this particular antenna coil, the primary themselves wrap around the coil in this area, and the secondary is located in this half of the coil. So you go back over to the schematic itself and you can see this loops down, and you notice that L1 and L2 are tied together on the south end of the coil as you're looking at it. If you follow this all the way down, you'll notice it's also grounded to the chassis. So the grounding actually occurs at this point here, back to the frame of the tuning condenser. And again, the frame of the tuning condenser on this particular radio is also attached to the rotor itself. So the rotor, and we'll spend more time, I'll show you how that's called out here on the schematic, is this grounding location. If you follow this lead here back across, you'll see it goes to this lug itself on the antenna coil, and then there's another connection here. So those two connection points make up the ground location and the tie-in points for the south end of this coil that we're looking at. Now again, if you go back and look at the coil itself here for L2, which is the secondary side, you'll see again that that ties into the tuning condenser. So let's move along and look at that tie-in point here on the tuning condenser, and you've probably figured that out because we only have the one lead left. You see that this connection point again went back to our volume control, so again I've got this other lead that comes off at this point here and wraps back across and attaches here to the lug on the cap, and again this would be notated as the stator itself, and we call this section, the way I have it notated here on the schematic, you can see is section C1. So you've got C1 here, and then this section here will be C5, I think is what I called it, and we'll look at that in more detail in just a moment. Before I produce a quick breakaway video here, let's just look at the circuit here one more time. Again, here's point L2, and here's point L4 called out. And you can see again, if you're looking at the capacitors indicated here, one section of the capacitor, and the second section I'm calling C2. So the connection points here for those is simply here and here. So hopefully that makes sense. Now let's go back and look again at my video here I was talking about and take a closer look at a tuning condenser that represents a dual gang that's very similar in nature to what you see here in my radio, as well as what's referenced in the schematic itself. Anyway, real quick, let's go back to the schematic symbol itself. Here's what we were looking at on the schematic. So this used to confuse me. You see the slanted line through the capacitor symbol, which makes sense. It means it's a variable device. Anyway, I've got this flat line at the top, and then I have, in most cases on the schematic, you'll see this curved line on the bottom side. Again, if you look at your connection points, the stator, as it's referred to, is this top flat line, and the rotor, which rotates in the tuning condenser, is this curved line. And again, the piece that moves here is always attached to the frame itself of the tuning condenser or variable capacitor. So I just thought I'd point that out real quick. We can do some measurements here real quick. I've got my meter set up so we can just look at continuity and just make sure I've got a good solder connection here to the frame. If I touch the frame here, you'll hear I've got continuity between those points. Now I've already said the rotor itself, again, which is the part that rotates, you can see it moving here. If I touch any of the rotor plates themselves, I'll have continuity, as you can see, regardless of the section, whether it be in my schematic section C1 or C2. Same thing for the shaft coming through the tuning condenser. If I touch it, you'll notice I have continuity because again it's part of the rotor itself. The stator connections themselves attach to the lugs here. So again, that would be your stator locations. This particular tuning condenser, you'll see has 2 lugs on this side, again one for each section, and if I flip it over you'll see the same. You may ask, well, why do I have 4 locations? Well, this location here, if you look at this where I've got this red lead attached, is actually the same electrically as this location here. It just gives the the builder or operator the ability to tie into either side of the tuning condenser. I shouldn't have anything here, which I don't, but if I go flip this lead around here to the white lead, which again attaches to this section of the tuning condenser, you'll see that I have continuity. So I could use either side of the tuning condenser itself to actually be the stator itself. It's just a matter of preference there. So I hope that kind of simplifies things again. Again, the rotor itself is attached to the frame, and again that's the part that rotates, and the stator, which is stationary, are the plates here, and they're always attached to the lugs themselves. Let me grab the LCR meter real quick and I'll hook up between the ground and again this is a dual section capacitor, and we'll do a quick capacitance check here between black and the white lead, the black and the red, just to demonstrate the capacitance itself of the tuning condenser. Okay, I'll try to zoom in where you guys can see that. Again, I'm going between the black again, which is attached to the frame, and again that's attached to the rotor itself. So you can see as I rotate the tuning condenser around, you can see the capacitance change. So this one seems to bottom out again. Again, there'll be a lot of stray capacitance because of my hands in proximity to this, as well as the lead length itself. Somewhere around 8 picofarads, and you can see what's called full mesh or full capacity with it closed. 186 picofarads. Now if I go over here to the red lead itself, it should read really close to the same, and you can see it does. I'm just under that 186. So again, I hope that's helpful. Just to recap, if we look at the schematic itself here in just a moment and look at the tie-in points for this section and a section here, the top stator, the way the schematic is indicated, will tie into the lugs themselves on the tuning condenser, and the rotor, again being attached to the frame, will be the ground location in most cases, unless the tuning condenser itself is isolated from the chassis. If it's isolated from the chassis, no big deal, it's still attached to the frame itself, and rubber grommets may be placed underneath the tuning condenser for mounting. I hope that last segment there made sense. Again, we've been looking at C1 and C2. And again, with that top horizontal line there of C1, if we look at the capacitor over here again, representing the stator, and again, that's where the lugs, the solder two lugs, are at on the tuning condenser. And the bottom section there with the curved line again, representing the rotor itself, which rotates and is attached to the frame itself. Now again, you can see in both cases on this particular radio, the rotor itself here goes down and actually goes to the chassis ground, and the same thing for this other section over here on C2 as well. Let's look at the remaining connection points here back over to the coil L3 and L4 briefly. Okay, going back to where we left off again, here is where L2 and C1 come together, again that being the secondary of the antenna coil, and also the variable tuning condenser section C1, that being the stator location. So let's look and see where that's at here on the radio. So again, section C1 is here, And again, so I think the giveaway, we already said that the stator itself has the lugs or the connection point on the tuning condenser, so it actually resides here, goes back over to here, and again that's the connection point back to L2 on the coil. And then it's probably hard to see in this particular photo, but it loops back across here, goes right up through this shielded lead up to a point, right to the grid number 1 of the 6D6 tube. So you can see where that's indicated here. Going back to the schematic just for a moment, I'll trace that out. And you can see it goes right back to G1. So hopefully that made sense. All right, moving along here, we're looking again at the primary of L3, as we're calling it. Again, this is the interstage coil that resides underneath the radio chassis here. And the tube that you see here is the 6D6, the bottom side of the tube. So again, I know it's hard to tell here in this particular photo, but this is pin number 3, 2, 1, and 6. So again, if you just look at the schematic itself, you'll see I've got this brand new red lead that attaches here to pin number 3. That's that new electrolytic, if you go back to the schematic down here, that I tied in. And if you trace it back here, you'll see it ties in to pin number 3. So that's what I'm indicating here. You also see that pin number 3, you can see ties in to the bottom side here of the primary of L3. And that's indicated right here. So that's my tie-in point. Now again, if I look at my connection point coming off the plate itself, or go back to L3 on the top side right here, and I do the same exercise and come back, you'll see my connection point is back to the plate, pin number 2 on the 6D6. So it may be hard to see here in this particular view, but again, my connection point is here. So that's the primary to the interstage coil, and completes this part of the circuit. Let's look at the secondary of the interstage coil as well. Real quick, here's a closer look at the interstage coil looking up inside the coil former tube. Again, this is represented as L3 on the schematic that I just showed, but check this out. If you look really, really close, you'll see the windings for the primary themselves coming off and going back to the coil. Okay, back to the secondary here, which is L4, that I'm calling out again on the interstage coil. You can see the ground connection here off of the coil that goes back down to the chassis. And that's indicated here if you go back to the schematic itself and look here. And then you'll see the capacitor, section number 2, is grounded as well. And we know that to be the case because the tuning condenser itself was attached to the chassis ground. So again, we've already talked about the rotor itself being that bottom section right here with kind of the curved line, actually being grounded on this particular radio, again that being the rotor itself. Now if you go back up to L4 and look at this other line that runs off, you'll see real quick in the photo that I'm sharing, I've got a new lead that I ran that goes from here back across, and it goes right back down through the chassis itself. And that actually goes right up to the tuning condenser itself. So it goes to the stator of section number C2. So that's our tie-in points here. And let me grab another photo here and just show you what that looks like. We're almost home. If you look at the photo there at the top left of the screen, you'll see the tuning condenser as I was removing it from the circuit to do the derusting and cleanup. And here's that wire that I cut right in this area. And again, that's the lead that ran underneath that connected itself to L4, the secondary of the Interstage coil. And you'll see that denoted by the red circle at the bottom. Again, the tuning condenser, C2, that I'm showing here, again, we're connecting back to the stator location, that being, the solder lugs that we were talking about. Now again, this is a pass-through design, so that stator location is available on the bottom as well as the top of the tuning condenser. So you'll see this lead that comes out here that goes over to a grid cap. That's also the stator location. And if you follow that on the schematic, I already have it highlighted, you'll see the L4 connection back to C2, and that routes back up and ties in to grid number 1 on the Charlie 6 tube. Now if you look at the bottom photo, same thing depicted again. This is again the stator location that I'm showing. And you can see here I'm just highlighting that lead that goes back over to grid number 1 on the tube. So I know these things can be confusing. I still get confused at times myself. Again, for those new in the hobby, I hope you found it helpful and informative. If you have any questions or need any additional information, just drop me a note in the comments. Thanks again for watching, folks. Take care.